Welcome to Willowworks Fine Florida Wood Turning. For this video, I'll be turning a bowl from start to finish using Spalted Sweetgum. Let's start by centering the blank on the lathe. The first thing I do is fasten a drive spur into the Nova 2 lathe chuck on the headstock. Next, I'll insert a live center into the tailstock. Once I center the blank to the drive spur, I'll tighten it into place with the tailstock. Next, I'll use my caliper to measure the diameter of the dovetail on a Longworth chuck, and I'll create this on the blank so that when I flip around the blank, it'll fit into the Nova chuck on the headstock. This is the bottom of the bowl that I'm working on now. I'm using a V-gouge chisel to mark out where the tenon will be. Make sure the blank is flush all the way across before you form the tenon. Now I know there's different ways to turn a bowl, but this is my favorite way. This is a little bit of a process, as you can see. It depends on how true the blank is when you first start. Once you have the size of your tenon, make sure that it's not too tall. The jaws on the Nova chuck need to touch the bottom of the bowl blank, rather than the dovetail touching the bottom of the chuck. If you make the dovetail too tall, it'll cause a flyout like this. Use your caliper to check the size of the tenon and adjust it as you need to. Now that the tenon is shaped, I can go ahead and rough in the shape of the outside of the bowl. So here I made a little mistake. Normally I take that down with a parting tool, but this time I got ahead of myself. The easiest way to take care of it is just sand it before you put it in the Nova chuck. Otherwise it'll be off balance like this. Now that I took care of that, all I need to do is just clean up and we can start hollowing the bowl. Now I'll remove the live center from the tailstock. Then I'll replace it with a drill chuck, and we'll use a Forstner bit to begin hollowing. For this next step, it's best to use 3/8 inch or smaller. Using a Forstner bit serves three purposes. Number one, it allows me to mark the depth of the bowl. Number two, it acts like the live center and reduces the chance of a pop fly. Number three, it allows me to start hollowing without using the chisel. First, I begin drilling slowly, but don't go the full depth of the bowl yet. Take this opportunity to go ahead and finish the outside walls of the bowl. Once I know where the outside wall of the bowl is, I can hollow the inside to match it. Here it's a good idea to go ahead and flatten the bottom of the bowl. That way, when I turn the bowl around to finish the bottom, all I have to work on is the center. Now I'm ready to start hollowing the inside. I sped this up to keep from boring you. It looks like I'm really flying through this. I'm actually turning this at around 2,000 RPMs. Notice I move the Forstner bit in slowly, little by little, and eventually I'll reach the full depth of the bowl. Here I move the tool rest back so I can drill in a little further. Remember, the camera speed is about 1.5 times faster than in reality. I love it when I get it to this point. Now you can begin to see some real progress. I'm using a nice sharp Robert Sorby bowl gouge for this. It's tempting to really push this chisel into the wood, but make sure you don't get in a hurry. Especially when you're turning spalted wood, because that means it's already a little bit rotten, and if you push the chisel too hard, you could bust this piece apart on the lathe. Now I'm going to go ahead and drill the full depth of the bowl. Now that the tailstock is removed, I'm going to start a process called turning between centers. All that means is that you're not using the tailstock to help stabilize the blank. This method allows you the freedom to swing the tool over the lathe bed and achieve the correct angle to hollow the bowl deeper. Since I've already used the Forstner bit to find the depth of the bowl, I can begin working from the center out. Here I'm switching over to the swan neck hollower. This tool gives me better access to the left side. I start sanding using 80 grit sandpaper. I use some of the shavings to cup the back of it so that it doesn't get too hot on my hand. This also acts as a buffing pad to allow the contact between the sandpaper and the bowl to be more even. Once I started sanding, I noticed it was a little thick right here on the edge, so I use a small side scraper to fix it. Always make sure the chisel is sharp and go very slow, making very light passes at this point. You can't afford to take too much or you could ruin the whole bowl. Now that I'm happy with this, I'll continue sanding. Now that I've made it up to 220 grit, I'll use my handheld rotary sander. The rotation of the sander allows me to sand in a crisscross pattern, which gives me a more even finish than sanding in just a straight line. After I'm finished sanding with the rotary sander, I'll continue sanding by hand and work my way all the way up to 1500 grit, and then it'll be time to apply the finish. Now it's time to apply the finish. Since I want the inside of it to be food safe, I'll use a food grade mineral oil and then I'll top it off with beeswax. Now that I'm done applying the finish, I'll remove it from the lathe and I'll place it upside down in this 12-inch Longworth chuck. You might notice that it looked like I'm struggling to put this thing in here in just a second. I really was. I almost made the bowl too big for this chuck. It did fit, but it took some work to get it in there. Now I need to tighten it. I'll start by just tightening a couple of the grippers, and then I'll remove the Nova chuck from the lathe and screw the Longworth chuck on. Notice the tape on the grippers. Without that, it'll leave black marks on your finished work. I started by tightening the grippers in a crisscross pattern, and then I go all the way around to check and make sure each one is tight. Now that the bowl is secure in the Longworth chuck, I slide the tailstock forward using the same Forstner bit that I used for hollowing the inside of the bowl. With the lathe set to the lowest speed, I ease the Forstner bit in just a little to hold the bowl in place and to take the very center off that dovetail. Here I use the V-gouge and work from the center out. For this process, make sure the chisel is sharp. Make very small passes, and whatever you do, don't get in a hurry. Even with the tailstock against the bowl, if I catch it wrong with the chisel, I could still make this bowl fly off the lathe. Use the Forstner bit as long as you can, and then slide it back. Now I use my V-gouge to remove the center mark that was left behind by the Forstner bit. Finally, I use a 1-inch skew chisel to give the bowl a nice flat finish across the bottom. Now that I'm happy with the way this looks, I'll start with 80 grit sandpaper again and work my way all the way up to 1500. Every time I finish with 1 grit of sandpaper, I stop the lathe and sort of scuff those marks in a backwards motion. Now it's time to apply the finish. First, I'll use a food-safe mineral oil, and for the exterior of the bowl, I use a thin CA glue. Now it's time to bring another bowl into the world. Voila! And they say you can't make nothing good out of sweet gum. The bottom is nice and flat on the inside and the outside, and the walls and the bottom are about the same thickness. I sincerely hope you found enjoyment in watching my video. I invite you to explore our curated selection on our Etsy store by following the link in the description below, where you can view and purchase these unique offerings for yourself. Thank you for watching Willowworks Fine Florida Wood Turning.